So today we have Professor Linda Tropp, who is a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and probably the world's leading expert on intergroup contact. She's too humble to say that either way, but I'll say it for her. And so Linda, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to be with you.
I like to start all of these out by just asking, what are the questions that most guide your research program?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm curious about, what drives people's thoughts, emotions, and motivations in relations with other groups. How do they feel they're being perceived as group members? What are their expectations for relations with other groups? And how does that kind of shape our kind of shared or divergent understandings of our positions in a shared society? So that's broadly really what led me to this area of work.
Okay, so I'd say this pretty much every guest, but it's self-evident to me why that's important topic to study. But I also like to give the expert their own words. And why do you think that this is such a pressing issue that we need to be studying in psychology?
Yeah, gosh, there have been so many times when I kind of wished that my scholarly expertise would become obsolete and no longer necessary in the world. But unfortunately, we see that, whether we talk about it in terms of prejudice or dehumanization or tolerance of difference or hope in group difference and supporting and respect for group differences, group boundaries continue to play a role. And I think one of the things that continues to fascinate and kind of trouble me is why we're still so quick to just care so much about our own group and kind of have blatant disregard for other groups. And it plays out in terms of polarization, in political contexts, in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of natural disasters, resources to basically who's on our radar and who's not on our radar. And I think, I understand, from a very logical, theoretical perspective, why this is from evolutionary perspectives, why it's the case, right? We have to preserve ourselves and our kin and make sure we have access to resources. And of course, that's our top priority. But at kind of a broader level, I feel like, I think about Trish Devine's work on breaking the prejudice habit. And I'm like, well, but we also have conscious processes. We're not all driven by our unconscious or our basic evolutionary infrastructure. And so it seems to be that we just lack the motivation oftentimes to try to understand how other people see the world and to really, envision space for a shared society as compared to having these kind of, what I see as knee-jerk reflexive responses to things that are different or that make us uncomfortable or that we might initially interpret as a threat without giving it much more thought.
Right, so kind of to jump off of that, I think the big picture takeaway from a lot of the intergroup contact research isn't necessarily all that different from other areas of research. For example, health behavior. You can tell people all you want that this is an unhealthy food for you, but there seems to be something more affective that you need to provide to them in order to actually change behavior. Just knowledge isn't enough. I think we see something similar in the intergroup relations, in the intergroup contact research, where it's just presenting people with information about disparities, racial disparities or other intergroup disparities isn't enough to kind of change attitudes or motivate action, but there does seem to be something specifically that's engaged with intergroup contact. So comparing just presenting people with the information versus having them experience some intergroup contact, what do you think are like the main differences between there that really we see these effects for intergroup contact?
Yeah, well, again, I'm biased, but I tend to think about it actually very much in line with Barlow a couple of years ago in 2018, where we talk about contact as a vehicle or mechanism towards psychological investment in others. I think it's easy for us to just kind of like click the channel, either metaphorically or actually, that we're just kind of like, yeah, is this interesting to me? Yes, no. And we kind of move on if it's not interesting. But I think something happens when we have like meaningful or sustained contact with other groups, especially, when we develop close ties or friendships with members of other groups. It's hard for us to say, yeah, I care about my friend, but not anyone else that my friend cares about, not their family, not their community. And so I think there is something about the emotional connections that take place that keeps us invested. So I wouldn't necessarily say that contact is the only mechanism or route through which shown that it's an effective one, that's part of the process that happens. And I find myself thinking about these issues more as we try to broaden the scope of contact research beyond how it was conceptualized for decades as just being about reducing prejudice. It's like, well, it's about changing our attitudes towards policies that would promote the welfare and interests of other groups? Is it going out and being willing to protest in solidarity with other groups to fight for their rights? I think we're actually seeing that because of these emotional ties and the psychological investment that we have in the welfare of other groups when we really connect with them. That's something that you don't get just from necessarily reading an article. So I think that's a big part of what happens. But with that said, I don't want to completely dismiss the more evolutionary side of things, because my sense, and again, I kind of think about this a bit in relation to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and getting our basic needs met, that, if we see other groups as threatening, it's really hard to then care about them, right? Because we have to care about us first. So I kind of think about it in terms of scaffolding or as stages in an intergroup relationship, where first we have to focus on reducing threat that we might perceive in our relations with that other group, because of and then that might make us more open to listening to their perspectives, caring about their concerns well, and really having a deeper sense of connection. I think it's a high bar to set to try to expect people to be so open to other groups if they're also being threatened or perceive that they're being threatened by them.
More fundamental attitude and prejudice first, and then that down the road that leads people to be more open to higher order thinking about policies or structures and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Actually, to go off of this idea of maybe evolution and how we've been thinking about intergroup contact, does seem like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it does seem like for a large swath of the literature, it was all about changing intergroup attitudes is an unambiguous good. But then as the research has evolved over time, we've also been looking at populations of disadvantaged group members. And there does seem to be some association between intergroup contact among disadvantaged group members being tied to less support for policy change or collective action. So in class, we're going to review a recent Nature Human Behaviour paper that you were on that kind of shows this nicely across a big sample. And so it seems like the big question for intergroup contact research right now is, well, how do we maximize the positive aspects of intergroup contact for both advantaged and disadvantaged group members while minimizing the negative aspects? So what do you think are some of the ways that we can tackle this issue in the years to come?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's exactly where the literature is at right now, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing glimmers of it when we look at research by, say, Julia Becker and Steve Wright and their colleagues, trying to think about what supportive contact looks like. That's a term that they've often used, saying group equality. And I think this is one of just a broader challenge. One of the broader challenges that we've had in the contact literature is we talk so much about the nature of relations or associations that contact has with other variables that we study, but we don't necessarily always know what's happening in the contact. So I think we actually need to be more attentive to well, what does that contact actually look like? And what are people actually doing when they're with each other? Or what are they actually saying to each other? So one thing, Ulu, one of my colleagues, has been to look at to what extent are they communicating about group differences as compared to not communicating about group differences in contact? Yeah. If we think about some of the other research on, say, EDSs in contact, I'm thinking of work by Tamar Sagi, her work clearly shows disadvantaged group members to have these false expectations for equal treatment because they're like, hey, we can get along with these advantaged groups, that everything will go well, and that they'll treat us fairly, yet the advantaged don't necessarily always managed fairly, even if they've changed their attitudes or had positive interactions with them. So I think we need to spend more attention or more time focusing on, what are they actually talking about?
So it seems like for advantage group members, intergroup interactions can be pleasant in a variety of different ways, and maybe they're deriving similar benefits from all these types of pleasant intergroup interactions. But for disadvantaged group members, it's most beneficial, or at least negative, when they're pleasant and substantive rather than pleasant and shallow. Substantive, or you're seeing something that this advantaged group member cares about the inequality or is motivated to address it, or at least is aware of it at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, for me, when I think about that issue, looking at research by Shnabel and her useful, thinking about the different psychological needs of advantaged and disadvantaged groups in those situations. Because if you're members of a disadvantaged group, and your group's been discriminated against and there are these structural inequalities, what motivation could you possibly have to want to interact with the advantage group where you're going to be exposing yourself to the possibility of discrimination or degradation, except to address those structural inequalities? It's not enough to know, sure, we can get along. It's not really compelling enough given what I might have to face or be confronted with in return.
So, I mean, you just said that this was the most important question facing intergroup contact research. So are there particular directions in this question, or avenues, or maybe new methods or technologies that you think are going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years that are really going to spark a lot of progress on this question?
Oh my goodness. I think of so many possibilities. One, I think, is paying more attention to the different stages of intergroup relationships, or the nature of the intergroup relationship that we call with some political scientists as well as psychologists who are interested in intergroup relations. And we were talking about how, our theories are not very well articulated to look at variability across contexts. So, in settings where there's been violent conflict between groups, should we expect the same effects of intergroup contact as what we would expect among elementary school kids in a non-violent context? I think there's also things that we can do with psychophysiology or linguistic coding to really pay more attention to kind of the physiological responses that people are showing and the types of things that people say that they might not be fully aware of that they're saying in an interaction, and how that is received by the other side. And of course, people like Nicole Shelton and Jackie Vorauer and Jen Richardson have been doing that type of work for years, but I think we might be able to really expand on that. And, in line with what Kara McInnes and Liz Page Gould have done to really try to integrate more of that dyadic interactional literature in intergroup relations with the broader legacy of the intergroup contact literature in terms of prejudice reduction or changing intergroup attitudes. But those are just a few thoughts off the top of my head. I have to say, it's been kind of mind-blowing to see the explosion or renaissance of research on intergroup contact. I think for many years it was kind of dying out a bit, and people just kind of got tired of the same old question, does contact reduce prejudice? But I can tell you, since Tom Pettigrew and I worked on that meta-analysis that we published in 2006, showing that generally there are positive contact effects. It's just, there's been a proliferation of studies in so many different directions, looking at the types of groups involved, looking at positive and negative forms of contact, looking at the potential for contact to promote or inhibit social change. It's really amazing to see how it's going.
As someone who doesn't do intergroup contact research, it does seem like this is a field that's really met the challenge of taking these findings out into the real world. This is something that many other people that I interviewed bring up, that now is finally time to study these things in the real world. But it seems like in the intergroup contact literature, we're getting studies among, historical groups that have had large hostilities towards each other, and we're actually getting psychological data from them about how they perceive each other and how we can improve those relations. So it's been very impressive to see lately. Jumping off something you said, mentioning text analysis, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, the rise of social media as maybe another way that we're seeing intergroup contact change. So this is a complicated question. I don't have you for too much longer, but what are some of the fundamental ways that you think social media has changed not only how people interact with each other across group lines, but how this process can be studied?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I am not very well experienced with like web scraping or doing any of that type of work. But I think just in my own experience as a user of some social media outlets, we see some incredible moments of connection between people who otherwise would have never had the opportunity to meet or to connect. And at the same time, we see great risk for entrenched patterns of polarization, because when people feel more anonymous or less accountable to others, they're more willing to say outlandish things. So I don't know how much of it is unique to social media per se, as compared to thinking about the facts media outlets represent, such as broader arrays of opportunities for cross-group engagement or interaction, particularly in national settings like the United States, where there are high levels of residential segregation, so we can actually exchange more with each other perhaps online than we would see in our own neighborhoods. And then globally, especially during the pandemic, when we can't travel as much internationally, that we can still stay connected to people from other nations and stay informed about different issues. But then at the same time, I think, when I start to think about the political context, the nature of political discourse in the United States, at least, I just see how quickly things deteriorate. I would not necessarily choose social media as the forum for implementing all ports optimal conditions for contact. Because even though people might have equal status in the situation, there's not exactly institutional supports reinforcing it respectfully as equals. And there's not necessarily cooperative interdependence. So I think, again, paying more attention to the motivations and goals that people have when they're engaging with difference. Is the goal to try to score points, to try to have a good one-liner, to try to get your argument across to the greatest number of people possible? Or is it really a goal that you have to try to focus more on the goals and motivations and interests of the people that you're interacting with? And so engagement necessarily means alliance. I think it has a lot to do with the types of goals that people bring to those different intergroup encounters.
Yeah, it almost seems like social media is unambiguous good or bad. It's much like the conditions for intergroup contact in the real world, no, in everyday life, non-social media life, I should say, just magnified. So the good is potentially magnified and the bad is potentially magnified as well. And it's up to us or the platforms themselves to kind of maybe perhaps guide people to think about using these things more productively. That was my take on it. But I just want to get you out on here on one question. I like to ask this for all people who come on and chat with me. You answered this question about intergroup contact specifically, and you can give a similar answer if you want, but thinking more broadly about intergroup relations, are there specific issues or questions that you really hope the field tackles in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh gosh. I think about things both kind of from a kind of conceptual or theoretical perspective, and then also kind of from a methodological effects of contact in a broader array of societal contexts where there has been direct violence between groups, like legacies of war, mass violence, genocide, conflict, as well as structural violence between groups, using the distinctions of direct and structural violence put out by Johan Galtung, who's more of a peace and conflict theorist, where structural violence really represents structural inequalities. And seeing for those very different types of violence, do we see the same mechanisms functioning in the same ways or similar ways, or are they quite different? I think that would be a really useful avenue for research. And I think we're starting to see enough studies out there, or at least interest from people in enough different societies examining regarding whether contact kind of functions the same way across different types of conflict conflict contexts, or whether we might need to think about different types of moderators or mediators depending on those types of contexts.
Okay, that's a great answer. You'll have to come back in 5 or 10 years and tell us how we solved it, and there's no more questions about that.
Then I can retire.
Yeah, exactly. But I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Linda. This has been so helpful and educational, and I really appreciate it.
Sure, I think it's so great that you're putting this series together. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.